I think we're up to the following questions. The Chazal tell us in the Midrash, and please tell me if I already did this, because my mind does not work like it used to. I'm not even sure it ever worked right.
Young man like you.
But, so tell me if we already covered this issue. Chazal tell us that because of four things, our ancestors were redeemed from Egypt. Shaloshinu es Shemam, they didn't change their names. Shaloshinu es Shonam, they didn't change their language. Shaloshinu es Malbusham, they didn't change their clothing. On that third one, there's a difference of opinion as to if that is the correct reading, or Shalo Golo Nistoros, they did not reveal secrets. And the fourth thing is Shahoyu Gedurim Ba'arayas. They maintained their family purity. They didn't sell their bodies to curry favor with their masters. Now, what is it that they didn't reveal secrets? When they were told by Moshe Rabbeinu, from Hashem, to borrow klei kesef, klei zohav, usmolos, silver, gold, and clothing from the Egyptians, they never told the Egyptians that they weren't returning, that they were never coming back to the land of Egypt, that they were going to the land of Canaan, they were going to their ancestral homeland, supposedly. And so the Egyptians lent them all these things. They did not tell the Egyptians they weren't coming back, and they had no intention of returning them. That is the secret that they maintained. And that enabled Hashem to fulfill his promise to Abraham, to Avrum Avinu. And after they served as slaves, Yetzu b'ruchush gadol, they'll go out with a lot of possessions. So they were able to borrow from the Egyptians because the Egyptians thought they were going to come back and return it. And therefore, God was able to fulfill his promise to Abraham, to Avram Avinu, that they would emerge from Egypt with treasure.
Can I ask you something?
Sure.
Rechush is necessarily related to Gashmius or also to Ruchnius?
Rechush in this case certainly means Gashmius. So go out with the Rechush Gadol, a lot of acquisitions, a lot of possessions. Now, this is a medrash that a lot of people know. And the question is, what does this medrash mean? First of all, where did they get these things from? They made them up. We're not big on making up our own religion. When the Navi wants to criticize Yerovam ben Nevat, the arch sinner from the book of Kings, it always says that he was Bodom mi libo. He made up his own religion. We don't believe in making up your own religion. If you don't follow the Torah and the mitzvahs, properly, you're making up, or you make up your own religion. There's no spiritual essence to making up your own religion. So where did they get this from? There's no mitzvah in the Torah that you must give your child a Hebrew name. There's no mitzvah in the Torah that you must speak Lashon HaKodesh, Hebrew language. There's no mitzvah in the Torah to dress in any particular way. And even the Hasidim that now have adopted a sort of national dress, that's only 250, 300 years at most.
It's a matter of identity.
Excuse me?
It's a matter of
identity. So what are you going to tell me? That these items preserve their identity. This was the way they preserved their identity, but that's not true. Why is that not true? Because who preserved their identity? The Egyptians. A person could not get up in the morning and say, I speak Egyptian. I'm going to dress like an Egyptian. I'm going to talk like an Egyptian. I'm going to walk like an Egyptian. And I'm going to be an Egyptian, and I'm not going to be a slave anymore. The Egyptians forced us to retain our identity because they enslaved us and would not allow the Jews to escape from that fate. They branded us as Jews. They made us wear a yellow star, we might even say. And as a result, we had an identity that was forced upon us by the Egyptians. And in fact, Halalu of the Avodah Zarah, the halalu of the avodah zarah. They became idolators in the Egyptian darkness. They became idolators. And the Chazal tell us that they sunk to the 49th level of impurity, and they abandoned bris milah. They abandoned the 7 Noahide laws. They abandoned Gid Hanosha. They abandoned all of the patriarchal tradition that was passed along. In Egypt, it was lost, and they did not follow it. So what good does it do that they didn't change their name? It did not protect their identity. The Egyptians protected their identity. It did not protect their spirituality because they abandoned their spirituality. So if that's the case, and this is made up, what benefit did this have? Why do Chazal say this is what merited their redemption? You know what that means? How do we understand this? So let's go and we'll ask some more questions. That's the primary question that we will address today. In the Chumash Bereshis, the last sentence of the book of Genesis is Vayomos Yosef, ben Meah ve'eser shanim. And Yosef died when he was 110. And they embalmed him, and he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. The last sentence of the book of Genesis records the death of Yosef at 110 years of age. In the fifth or sixth sentence of the book of Shemos, it says, Vayomos Yosef, and Yosef died. V'chol echav, and all of his brethren, v'chol ador hahu, and the entire generation died. And then it goes on to say how Paro decided to enslave the Jews. Okay. Well, it's obvious that Yosef did not die twice, once in Bereshis and once in Shemos. He died only one time. But what is the significance of Yosef dying in the book of Genesis and Yosef dying in the book of Shemos? So, the book of Genesis is the book of the patriarchal figures of humanity, including the Jewish people. Adam, his son Sheth, Noah, his son Shem, Terach, Avrum Avinu's father, Yishmael, Yitzchak, Esav, Yaakov, all of those patriarchal figures are mentioned, and they live and die in the book of Genesis. Yosef's death takes on two dimensions. He dies among the patriarchal figures in the book of Genesis, and he dies together with his brothers in the book of Shemos. What's the significance of that? Well, the patriarchal figures, which are all in Shema and Bereshis, and Yosef is considered a quasi-patriarchal figure. Why is that? Because he bores two tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh. Ephraim and Manasseh, his sons, Keruven and Shimon, Yehudim. Yaakov says, I will count Ephraim and Manasseh as two separate tribes, and they will be equal to me as Reuven and Shimon, meaning they will be equal to two tribes. How does that come out? There's only 12 tribes. So whenever Yosef is counted, he's not counted because his two sons are counted in his place. And Levi is not counted because Levi doesn't get a portion in the land of Israel. So the 12 tribes are the 10 brothers and the two sons of Yosef, Ephraim and Manasseh, complementing 12. Therefore, Yosef is like a father because he spawns and bears two tribes, two sons that become tribes. But that's not enough because he invested spiritual DNA mentoring in his two sons. But to be a patriarchal figure, he has to ingest or infuse or put into the spiritual DNA of Am Yisrael, not just his two tribes, but the entire nation. So what is Yosef's contribution to the entire nation? What does he do that makes him a patriarchal figure because he put some essence into the nation of Israel?
According to God.
We'll see. You're right. We'll see. Let's go and ask another question. In the book of Joshua, which is the first book of the books of the Nevi'im, the book of Joshua, at the end of the book, Yehoshua gathers the nation to Shechem, to the city of Shechem, and there he emulates his master Moshe Rabbeinu, and he gives his farewell address. And his farewell address warns the children of Israel about certain things that might befall them, and he urges them to observe the Torah and keep the mitzvahs. And this is his address to the nation. He gathers them in Shechem. Why would he gather them in Shechem? After all, Yehoshua, when he crosses the Yarden, erects the Mishkan that was transported from the desert in Shiloh. And he puts it on a stone foundation. And for 369 years, the Mishkan stood in Shiloh. It was the spiritual center of the people. There Elkanah takes Hannah and his other wives and his children on the 3 pilgrimages every year, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. He would go to Shiloh, offer sacrifices in accordance with the obligation, to go up to the Mishkan or to the temple, which was not yet built, to celebrate the holidays, offer special sacrifices. That's where he should have gathered the people, to the spiritual center of the nation, which he himself established. Why does he take them to Shechem for his farewell address?
Isn't that the site where the blessings and the curses took place
Oh,
when they first entered?
Oh, that was on Har Eval and
And Shem is right between
Okay, but still, he should have taken them to Shiloh. That's the spiritual center. Okay, the Samaritans or whatever they call themselves, they keep Har Eval or whatever, they keep it as a holy place. But we did not keep it as a holy place. Once the curses and the blessings were offered on the 2 parallel mountains, there's no Kedusha there. It's no more holy than any other place in Israel. What is holy? Where the temple stands, Jerusalem. And before the temple, what was holy? Shiloh, where the Mishkan stood. He should have, we would think, have gathered them at the spiritual center of the people, warning them about idolatry, warning them about the insidious influence of the nations. Why would he gather them in Shechem instead of Shiloh? Now, the next question is...
So what's so important about Shiloh before then?
Yaakov Avinu said, Ad ki yovo Shiloh, and the brachas, but okay, Shiloh was a place that was chosen. Why it was chosen is beyond the scope of what I'm dealing with now. But basically, the next question is, how does the book of Yehoshua end? What's the last sentence in the book of Joshua? The last sentence is this: Atzmos Yosef, asher helu b'nei Yisrael mi'eretz Mitzrayim kovru b'Shechem. The bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel brought up with them from Egypt, were buried in Shechem. Now Joshua dies 28 years after crossing the Jordan and entering the land of Israel. It's preposterous to assume that they waited 28 years to bury Yosef. They didn't bury Yosef until Joshua died? Impossible. What's the significance of putting that sentence totally out of chronological sequence? Because most likely and almost 100% sure, they did not wait 28 years to bury Yosef. They buried him in Shechem long before Joshua dies. So why does the Sefer Yehoshua end with that lesson? Question. Next question. Hopefully we won't have time to answer it. The next question is, in Parshas Vayigash, which was last week's Parsha, the Torah records, I think it is 14 sentences about how Yosef bartered with the Egyptians and gave them food. Okay? He gave them, first he traded them for the food, for their money. Then the Torah tells us they ran out of money. He traded them for their livestock. Then they ran out of livestock. He traded them for their land. And then they ran out of land. So he traded them for their indenture. They became indentured servants to Paro. Why does the Torah tell us this? 14 psukim. What do we care? What happened to the Egyptian people in Egypt? And what does the Torah go out of its way to tell us? Rak admasa kohanim. Only the lands of the priests were not included. In other words, Yosef did not charge them and barter for food for their land. He gave them food without them having to pay. Why do we care? What's this doing in our Torah? How does this affect the eternity of Israel? Another question is sort of a minor question is, when Moshe Rabbeinu and Paro engage in their confrontation, and Moshe says, Shalach es ami v'yavduni, send out my nation so that they may serve me, meaning Hashem. Send out the children of Israel, the people of Israel, so that they may serve God. Paro then produces his magicians. Why doesn't he produce his priests? This is an ideological battle. This is a battle between v'yavduni, they should serve me, God, versus the Egyptian idols that Paro served. Or why would he ignore his priests in that confrontation and bandy out his magicians? Another question. When Paro wants to enslave the Jewish people, he says the following sentence. The Torah records, Hava niskaknalo, let us be wise, let us take counsel against them. Hava niskaknalo. Right? Pen yirbeh, lest it being the singular, pen yirbeh, lest it, the Jewish people, multiply. V'haya ki sikrena milchama, it will be when a war strikes us. V'nilcham banu, they, or it, not v'nilcham, they. I didn't say v'nilchamu banu, they will wage war against us. It says it again, the Jewish people will wage war against us. V'olam min ha'aretz, and it will go out of the land. Rashi brings the Gemara that darshan v'olam min ha'aretz. And the Gemara says, no, Ba'olam min ha'aretz does not mean it, the Jewish people will go out of the land. Ba'olam means we will be forced out of our own land. Why would the Gemara come along and change the simple meaning? In that sentence, the singular applies to the Jews, the plural applies to the Egyptians. Along comes the Gemara and says the final singular applies to the Egyptians. Moshe Kapaya, why is it doing that, turning the pasuk on its head? The next question. After the Egyptians enslaved the Jews, it says before that actually, it says, Vayokom melech chodosh asher lo yoda es Yosef. A new king arose in Egypt who did not know Yosef. Rav and Shmuel, the two great Amoraim from the Talmud, Rav and Shmuel, disagree. Does Vayokom melech chodosh mean a new king, or does it mean the old king? One says it means a new king. New king arose who didn't know Yosef. Simple meaning, simple. That's what it says in the pasuk. Melech chodosh, a new king. The other one says, no, it's not a new king. It's the old king.
He reinvented himself.
But it's the old king that Yosef basically saved. That Yosef saved the land from its hunger. Why would one of these two great Amoraim, because the Gemara does not identify which one said what, but it just tells us that they had this disagreement amongst themselves, why would one of them insist that it was the old king? After all, when Yosef stood before the king when he was taken out of the dungeon, after the Sar Hamashkim, the butler, said to Paro, I know of a young lad in the dungeons who knows how to interpret dreams, and he's brought before Paro. How does it describe Yosef? As a Nar Ivri, a young Hebrew. Now, if Paro was a young man, less than Yosef in age, would you say, well, I met this young whippersnapper in jail, his name was Yosef. Would he say that to the king who's younger than Yosef? No, it would be disrespectful. When he said that Yosef was a young lad, he's saying, Paro, we are mature, we're older. There was a young man in the jail who can understand. So it seems clearly, at least impliedly, that Yosef was younger than Paro. Yosef was 30. Yosef's 110 when he dies. That's 80 years later. Levi, who lives the longest from the tribes, lives to 147. He lives another, 17 years beyond Yosef, or maybe even more. And therefore, Paro would have been 150. If it was the original Paro, he'd be 150 years old at least. So why would anybody insist that it's the same Paro? When the Torah says, Melech Chadash, a new Paro, a new king, why would one of them say, no, it's the old king? It strains credibility because they would have been, an old man, 150 plus years old. So these are the questions. Now let's see if we can figure out a thread that will tie all this together. So now we ask the question, what were the merit of the four things that the Jewish people adopted? Where did they get it from? What benefit of it is it? It's not from the Torah. It didn't preserve their identity. The Egyptians preserved their identity. It did not preserve their spirituality. They abandoned their spirituality and they sunk into idolatry. So what was the benefit? So the end of the Chumash Bereshit tells us, Vayash ba Yosef es bnei Yisrael, and Yosef imposed an oath on the children of Israel, a solemn oath. Kokod yivkod Elokim eschem, God will certainly remember you. V'halisem es atzmosai mizeh itchem, and you shall take my bones with you when you return to the land of Canaan. When God will remember us, and when God will redeem you, take my bones with you. Al nosik bereni, do not bury me in Egypt, take my bones with you. This oath was the only thing they remembered. Let's go a little bit forward. Moshe Rabbeinu walks out of the desert. He's 80 years old. When did he leave Egypt and go to the land of Midian, where ultimately he meets Zipporah and Yisro, etc.? We all know the story. It says, Vayigdal Moshe vayetze el Echa. And Moshe matured, and he went out to his brethren. He went to see the plight of his brethren. So he emerges from the palace, goes out to see what's going on in the countryside, and lo and behold, he sees an Egyptian striking a Jew. And he kills the Egyptian, buries him in the sand. Next day he comes out, and he sees two Jews fighting. And he says to one of them, who's raising his hand against his fellow Jew, Rasha lomo sakes reyecha, wicked one, why are you striking your friend? And what do? They turn on Moshe and they say, are you intending to kill us like you killed the Egyptian? Yesterday we saw you kill an Egyptian. Are you going to kill us today like you killed the Egyptian? And Moshe says, whoa, it is now known, it's spreading throughout the countryside that I killed an Egyptian. And he was forced to flee for his life because he feared that Paro was trying to kill him, which he was. Paro found out he killed an Egyptian, capital offense, imposed a death sentence on Moshe, and Moshe ran for his life. So he matured for that 2 days, went out to his brothers and identified as a Jew for 2 days, and he's forced to run for his life. So we asked before, what did it mean, Vayigdal Moshe, and Moshe matured? Well, in the Torah, there's two standards of maturity. One is 13, when a person, a young boy, becomes obligated in the yoke of mitzvahs. And the second standard of maturity is when you reach 20. 20 years old, you go into what's called the army. Let's assume he was 20. He comes out of the desert when he's 80. 60 years later, he walks out of the desert and he says, God sent me to redeem you. Oh, yeah? Where you been for 60 years? Who are you? Where you come from? What's going on here? That would have been natural questions people would have asked. How does Moshe Rabbeinu convince them that he's the Redeemer? Because in his first encounter with the Jewish people, he invokes those magical words, Pakod Yivkod, I have come here because God has remembered you. And that oath that Yosef imposed on them emblazoned himself into the national psyche. It became the only thing the Jewish people remembered from their tradition was that they were going to be redeemed. And therefore they accepted Moshe as the Redeemer immediately. Of course, later on, when things got a little bit worse, they got angry at him. But at the point that he comes out of the desert, he is accepted because he invoked those special words. That's what Yosef imbued in the national psyche of the Jewish people, the hope and the anticipation of redemption. The Gemara says in Shabbos, Lamed Aleph, there are 6 questions that a person is asked at the pearly gates. The first question is, Nosata v'nosata be'emuna. Did you engage in honest business practices? The second question one is asked is, Kavata itim la Torah. Did you establish set times to study Torah? The third question is, Asakta v'privi v'rivya. Did you engage in procreation? The fourth question is, Sipiso Yeshua. Did you longingly anticipate redemption? Why is that such an important question? Okay, I don't anticipate redemption. It's not even a mitzvah. There's no mitzvah to anticipate redemption. It's not one of the 613 mitzvahs. Why is that such an important question? The answer to that is that we, the Jewish people, went through almost 2,000 years of persecution. We were killed, we were raped, we were robbed, we were driven out of countries, we were humiliated. Everything, all the terrible things that happened to us throughout the years of the diaspora. If we did not have a hope of anticipation, if we did not believe b'chol yom sheyovo, that any day Mashiach could come and this all would come to an end, all of our suffering would end, if we did not maintain that hope, we would have been crushed and obliterated and forgotten in history because the suffering was so great, the calamity so terrible, we would not have survived. This is what Yosef implanted. He told the Jewish people, don't get crushed by your suffering, by the terrible conditions of slavery that Paro is imposing. Remember one thing, that we, the Jewish people, will be redeemed. That's what Yosef imbued into the national psyche. That's why he's considered a quasi-father figure. That's what was necessary in order for the Jew to survive the Egyptian persecution and the persecution of the last 2,000 years. And even today, when we're suffering from this terrible war in Gaza and the atrocities that Hamas committed, almost on the lips of everybody, Mashiach should come because we need a salvation. We need to have a hope that this terrible, period in our history will come to an end. We will be triumphant. We will defeat Hamas, and we will survive as a people. And we hope that this is the beginning of the Askalta de Geula, meaning although the state of Israel is Askalta de Geula, this is another step in the right direction. So that's what Yosef imbued in our people, the hope and anticipation of redemption.
Look at us up to 45.
Up to 1945? Ani mamim be'amuna shalema b'vias HaMashiach.
This can be said by a religious Jew.
Well, the religious Jews carried the people. You know, they say there's no atheist in a foxhole. You heard that expression? There's no atheist, meaning there's no one who doesn't believe in God when they're sitting on the front line facing the enemy. Everybody will turn to Hashem and offer and say, please help me.
In 1938, it was different.
Okay, I don't know, but anyway, people in the concentration camps, people sang on imamim on the way to the gas chambers. There was always this hope of redemption, and that's what kept us alive. Okay, I already went over that. Okay, so now that's what Yosef imbued. Along comes the Torah and tells us, patriarchs imbue us with positive lessons, and patriarchs imbue us with negative lessons. For instance, the Gemara says, "Olam al yishana olam mibonav bein habonim." A person, a father, a parent should not favor one child amongst his other children. Why not? Because of a multicolored garment, like Sonis Pasim, because Yaakov favored Yosef, which engendered the jealousy and the hatred of the brothers. Nisgalgulu avoseinu l'Mitzrayim. Yaakov was one part of the problem. His parenting skills were not so good, at least not the Chazal are very critical. They say that because he did not engage in proper parenting skills, and he favored one son from among his other children.
He should have, when Yosef came home and said what he said about the dream, he sat back and didn't say anything.
Aviv shomaras hadavar, right? Okay, so therefore you see from Chazal, this is not, a Baba Maisa. The rabbis are critical of Yaakov because we should learn from his lesson of what not to do. Do not favor one child over another to the point where you cause jealousy. Rav Shamshon Rafal Hirsch says, on the pasuk Vayigdalu HaNa'arim, and the two twins, Yaakov and Esav, grew up. Says, and then it says, Vahi Esav ish be'atzayid ish sadeh. Esav was a man of the field and a hunter, and Yaakov was Ishtam, an integrated person, Yoshev Oalim, who dwelled in tents. Now, first says, Vayigdu HaNa'arim, that Yaakov made a mistake. He educated them the same. They were treated equally. And the Chazal tell us, Chanoch Menara Pidarko. Educate your children in accordance with their propensity, in accordance with their potential, in accordance with their characteristics. You can't treat everybody the same. If you treat every student the same, you will not be a good teacher. A good teacher learns to identify the needs, the potential, the strengths, the weaknesses of each student, and direct his teaching in that mode. So again, we learn a negative thing from the way Yaakov raised his sons. I'm sorry, the way Yitzchak raised Yaakov and Esav. The way Yitzchak raised Yaakov and Esav, there was a fundamental mistake because he treated them and educated them equally. So you see that it is possible to learn what not to do from the teachings of the patriarchs. So we just established that Yosef has patriarchal traits. He imbued the children of Israel. He, first of all, fathered two tribes. Second of all, he imbued the Jewish people with the hope for the future. And how we'll come to a negative thing that we learn from the life of Yaakov, the life of Yosef. Sorry, from the life of Yosef. Gretz, the famous Jewish historian, tells us in his History of the Jews that the reason that Chalmaniki, the mad Cossack, who killed maybe 100,000 Jews and tortured them and terrible things the Ukrainians did to the Jews, says, you know why that happened? Because the Jews were the tax collectors for the Polish lords. Poland ruled over Ukraine at that time. The Polish king imposed a tax on the Ukrainians, and lo and behold, who did he appoint to be the tax collectors? He appointed the Jews. There were Jewish tax collectors who extracted the tax from the Ukrainians, and when the Ukrainians revolted against the Polish overlords, they vented their anger against the Jews, and therefore they committed these atrocities against the Jewish people.
Absolutely.
That's what they learned from. What they did was they did not draw the lesson from Yosef. But we can ask a question. How did the Egyptians turn on the Jewish people to the extent that they were able to drown infants? Little boys who were just born, they could throw them into the sea and drown them. How do you get to be so vicious? How do you get to be so angry You get to be so angry when you mistreat the common folk. What did Yosef do? First of all, who raised all the crops that Yosef used to barter with the Egyptian people? The Egyptian people raised these crops. They were there. They had abundance of food, abundance of wheat and whatever else they grew. And Yosef gathered it on behalf of the king. So it was their crops. Now Yosef turns on them and says, okay, you want your crops back, which I stored? Pay. But the hunger lasted for 2 years out of the 7. Why? Because when Yaakov Avinu came down to Egypt, the hunger ceased. He came down at the end of 2 years to Egypt to meet his son, join with his son, and the hunger ceased. So within 2 years, what did Yosef do? Strip them of their money, strip them of their livestock, strip them of their land, and indentured them. Now I'm going to ask you a question. Would Avrum Avinu have done that? When stragglers came down the road and they came across the tent of Avrum Avinu, which had opening doors on all 4 sides, would Avrum Avinu say, come into my tent, give me your credit card. You want to eat something here? Oh, in town it's $1.50. I'm charging you $10. You're hungry? Did Avram Avinu barter for the food that he gave those people? Did he extract exorbitant prices from them? Did he strip them of their assets? Did he rob them of their dignity? No. He gave it to them for free. That's the midah of Avram Avinu. That is the chesed. That is the patriarchal tradition. Here Yosef, not for himself, he didn't take this money. He put it in the coffers of Paro. He enriched Paro. And Paro became wealthy because of Yosef's efforts. So he didn't do it for his own aggrandizement. He did it to serve, let's call it the feudal overlord. Let's call it the king. Comes along the Torah and tells us, if you're going to serve the king, if you're going to bribe the church, and you're going to think that when the time comes, they're going to save you, anech digato. You know what that means?
Forget it.
Forget it. The king's not going to save you. The church is not going to save you. The peasants are going to rise up and attack you. You need to treat the peasants fairly and properly. You mistreat them, it will come back on you. That's a lesson from Yosef's treatment of the Egyptians. That's a lesson that our people never learned. And that's a lesson that Gretz points out in Jewish history, that it caused many troubles for our people. And that is something the Torah tells us. We don't have to look to Gretz. We look to our Torah. The Torah is telling us in 14 sentences. The Torah doesn't mince words. The Torah doesn't waste words. The Torah is telling us, look what happened. Look what Yosef did. Do not do this. Now, these are very bold words. So I need to reinforce this. I need to bring some proof. None of the rabbis say what I say. I am extracting this from my interpretation of the Torah, but I will bring two points, 2 proofs that will support my thesis. You want to say something? 2 points that will support my thesis. When the Torah tells us, Hava nischak malo, let us be wise, when Paro says, let us be wise, against it, because if there is a war and we fight the enemy, it will go up from the land. Says the Torah, says the Chazal, it means the Egyptians. What do the Gentiles accuse us of? We control the banks. We control the media. We control Hollywood. We control everything, the stock market, everything we control. The Jews control the Jews. That's what they said. That's what's happening here. What did Paro say? Let us be wise against them. Their intent is to take over our land. We will be driven out of our own land. That's what the Chazal are telling us. Harvard, MIT, University of Pennsylvania. We used to be 25% of the population, the student population. We're down to 5%. They don't want us. They hate us. They're anti-Semitic. I won't comment on that right now, but I will comment on that too. But basically, what's happening here is the Chazal were telling us that the government, the Pharaoh, will turn on us. Vayakom melech chadash. Why would anybody say it's the old king? One of our Chazal, one of our Amoraim, either Rav or Shmuel, says it's the same old king. Don't think the king's going to protect you. Don't think the priests are going to protect you. The old king that you saved, you are the money lenders. You supported him and raised money for his armies. You did everything. You were the tax collectors. You served the king with great loyalty and fidelity. Don't think the king is going to protect you when the peasants rise up. Don't think the church is going to protect you. It's Melech Chadash. It's the old king. No one is going to protect you except Hashem. Do not abuse the peasants. Do not act in ways that are not part of the Abrahamic tradition of Avrum Avinu. Don't mistreat the populace and then expect that the king or the power will save you. You will be doomed. That's the lesson of Vayokem Melech Chadash. And that's the lesson of Hava Nischakmelo. And that's the lesson of the 14 sentences in Parshas Vayigash that tell us about how Yosef stripped the dignity of the Egyptian people and it came back upon us. This is another thing that we learn from a patriarch. Some message that should have entered into our practices, into our psyche, but it did not. And this is what dogged us throughout the 2,000 years of our experience in Galus. So that's another factor that we learn out from Yosef, a negative factor, just like we learn out from Yaakov Avinu, a negative factor, not to favor one child over another. Now we ask the question, why did Yoshua gather the people to Shechem? Why did he not gather them to Shiloh? Why does the Sefer Yoshua end with the sentence that the bones of Yosef that they took up from Egypt were interred in Shechem? Totally out of chronological sequence. The answer to that is, what did Yoshua leave undone when he died? The Torah tells us, when you wage war against the Canaanite nations, lo sechaya kol neshama, don't leave any soul alive. Because if you do, they will be thorns in your side and thistles in your eyes.
So the same thing for the seven folds?
Yes.
As it was said for Amalek.
Really, it says it by the 7 nations, and we extrapolate to Amalek. We say it applies to any Mechenes Mitzvah, Amalek is Mechenes Mitzvah. It says it by the 7 nations. Do not leave any of them alive. Why? Because ultimately, the next generation, even if you leave the children alive, they will rise up and come against you. And we see that in the days of Shlomo HaMelech, which we learned from Sefer Melachim, where David eradicated Aram, he conquered Aram, and Ben-Hadad, the young son of the king, escaped to Egypt, and he lived in tranquility in Egypt, and Paro raised him. We ask the question, why would Paro raise an enemy of his son-in-law? The answer to that is that Paro realized that Shlomo used him, married his daughter only to secure the security of Israel. Once Paro realized that, how did he realize that? Because once the Beis Hamikdash was finished, Shlomo took the daughter of Paro out of the holy city and put her palace or her home in the Milo, in the weakest link in the security fence around Yerushalayim, the security wall around Yerushalayim. Because he said, if any enemy wants to come and attack my palace, my kingdom, my Beis Hamikdash, they will have to go through the daughter of Paro, the weakest link in the wall. And therefore, Paro realized that Shlomo used him all this time just to obtain security. So therefore, he allowed Ben-Hadad to live in Egypt in peace, even though he was a sworn enemy of the Jewish people. And ultimately, Ben-Hadad grows up, returns to Aram, and wages war against Israel. So we see, Lo Sechaya Kol Neshama means be careful about your future. If you leave the children alive even, the children will grow into adults and they will rise up against you. If you leave them in the camps, in the refugee camps, 75 years later, the children will rise up and become
What is
Hamas.
written? לא תחיה כל אדם.
לא תחיה כל נשמה.
איפה?
בחומש. בדבורים.
Yeah, but it's before the conquer.
Yeah, it was in time of Moshe Rabbeinu. Yeah, it's in the Torah. It was telling the Jewish people, when you go into the land of Israel and you engage the 7 Canaanite nations, do not leave a soul alive. Because if you leave them alive, 75 years later in the refugee camps, they'll produce Hamas. That's what the Torah was knowing about.
But we must treat them.
But there wasn't a Amalek.
That wasn't Amalek, that was the 7 nations. We conquered their land, we dispossessed them.
Wasn't that because they didn't kill Agag?
No, that's much later. That's in the days of Shoal. We're talking about Joshua's war to liberate the land of Israel from the Canaanite nations. In that war, you were not supposed to leave alive anybody. But Yoshua, tired of war. They spent 7 years fighting Amalek. We spent 81 days fighting Hamas, and we're beginning to tire of the war, God forbid. That's what happened in the days of Yoshua. The people said, listen, we just came from 40 years in the desert. We want to come and we want to enter our land. We want to sit down, ish tachas kafno, v'ish tachas teinaso, every family in its own little parcel of land, growing its own produce. We want to sit near our fig trees and our olive trees. We want to raise wine. We want to have a family life. We don't want to be warriors. We're tired of being warriors after 7 years. And so they stopped the battle against the Canaanites. God forbid we should stop the battle against the Hamas because we tire of the battle.
Did we mistreat them in the 60s?
Well, I'm worrying about now what we did. They mistreated themselves.
Excuse me?
They mistreated themselves. There's no nation in the world that is a refugee nation for 75 years. You don't have refugees for 75 years. They integrate into the country that they're found to be founded.
Like we did.
Like the Jews did in the United States, like the Jews did in Europe until the Nazis. Like the Jews do in Australia. We get integrated into the society. We don't sit there in camps, reading and educating hatred. We learn to accommodate to the facts of history.
So how come that Rambam did not understand that?
Who says he didn't?
That their religion is against us.
It is.
But what does he say that?
He doesn't say that
He doesn't say that it's not Avodah Zarah.
He calls them fools. The Rambam calls the Muslim faith stupidity.
It's sure.
Foolish. Okay, because, and he was very opposed to them, very opposed to the
But
Muslim
he gave
faith.
him a hechsher.
But he said they're not idolatry. They're not idolaters in order to save the Jews of Yemen. He did not want the Jews of Yemen to feel that they abandoned their faith because in a moment of terror, they said, what did they say? Allah something and Muhammad is his prophet. That's all they did. They came sweeping through Jewish communities and they forced the Jews, they gathered them together and they forced them to say, Allah is God and Muhammad is his prophet. You say that, you live, and you go home.
But they were not even Bnei Noach.
They weren't Bnei Noach, they were Bnei Yishmael. Okay, they are Bnei Noach. I mean, in a sense, Noach is the father of all of humanity.
Well,
But
they
basically-
killed for nothing.
Good, they're Rutzkim, they're terrible.
So they're
Okay.
not Bnei Noach.
Well, they violate the Sheva Mitzvahs, okay?
So how can they get the
But they
hechsher?
don't believe in idolatry. They make up their own religion. We've talked about
And they
that.
got a hechsher.
They got a hechsher for the people of Yemen. They should not feel that they abandon their faith and give up Judaism. The Chacham from Baghdad said about the Jews of Yemen, they are no longer part of Klal Yisrael. They said Muhammad, Allah is God and Muhammad is his prophet. The Chacham of Baghdad wrote,
Ben Ish Chai.
no, Ben Ish Chai is 100 years ago. The Chacham of Baghdad is like 400 and 500 years ago. The Chacham of Baghdad wrote to the people of Yemen, you are no longer part of Klal Yisrael. You abandoned the faith. You embraced Islam. Goodbye, Charlie. The Rambam wrote and attacked the Chacham of Baghdad. and said he does not know what he's talking about. Chas v'shalom, that because they made that single sentence utterance that they are no longer part of Klal
What
Yisrael.
single sentence?
Allah is God and Muhammad is his prophet.
They said that.
That's what they were forced to say.
Okay.
So the Rambam said, by saying that, you didn't say anything terrible, that you should lose your chelik in Olam Haba, you should become now no longer part of Am Yisrael. You are still part of Am Yisrael because Allah is God, and God is, the Muslims believe in one God. Okay. How did we get into this? I don't remember. But back on track here. So therefore, we learn from Yosef all of these things. Oh, so what? The Canaanite, the tribes of the Canaanite nations were left in small pockets throughout the land of Israel, and they became thorns in the side of the Jewish people. Ultimately, we learned from their pagan idolatrous practices, and they corrupted us. And that's what Yehoshua was warning against. And he said, I'm gathering you in Shechem. Why Shechem? Because that's where I buried the bones of Yosef. Remember what Yosef did. He withstood being isolated alone in Egypt. He maintained his spiritual connection to the Jewish people. He believed in Hashem, and he believed in the 7 mitzvahs. He educated his children properly. Yosef is a shining example of a Jew who survived all alone in the diaspora, surrounded by pagan idolaters. So when Yehoshua was taking leave of the Jewish people and warning them that we tired from completing the job and we left pockets of Canaanites alive, remember and draw lessons from Yosef. Don't emulate them, don't learn from them. He tried to impress upon them not to do what they ultimately did do. They learned from the Canaanite practices, and the kingdom of Israel slipped into idolatry. Comes along the Navi and tells us, why did Yosef gather the people in Shechem? Atzmos Yosef kovru b'Shechem. What was special about Shechem were that the bones of Yosef were buried there. That's the final lesson in the life of Yehoshua. Of course, Yosef was buried many years earlier, but the Navi wants us to know that Yehoshua chose Shechem to give his farewell address and not Shiloh, so that we would remember the lessons from Yosef's life, that Yosef did not succumb to the idolatrous pagan practices that surrounded him on all sides when he was alone in the land of Egypt. That strength that Yosef had, which we hoped was imbued in the children of Israel since he was a patriarchal figure, unfortunately, over time it waned, and the Jewish people slipped into idolatry. They emulated the practices of the Canaanite pagans who lived amongst them, and therefore this is another final lesson in the life of Yosef HaTzadik. Remember, my children, remember, people of Israel, do not let the foreign influence, even though we were in the Gullus for a long time, and even though now modern media makes it as if the world is all one marketplace, do not allow the assiduous influences of the Gentile Western world to corrupt our spiritual identity and our spiritual essence.
Where is your
Final lesson of Yosef.
Where does tzaddik come from?
Yosef HaTzadik is from Chazal. It's not in the biblical narrative at all. But they ascribed Yosef to be Yosef HaTzadik, for he withstood the blandishments of Potiphera, the wife, who tried to seduce him. And not once, but daily, Chazal tells us, every day, she disrobed in front of him. She disrobed and tried to seduce him year after year, day after day.
I had 2 questions related one to the other. Why did Yosef impoverish on the land of Mitzrayim? And connected to this, how come Vayitzev the Rechush Gadol if they were impoverished?
Okay, because that was 210 years later. When he was alive, he impoverished them, but over time, what did he? At the end, it says he indentured them, but then he came up with a plan. I'll give them seed. They'll work the land. These
80%, 20%.
80% went to them and 20%, or do I forget whether it was 80% to power, 20% to them, or 20% to them and 80% to power? So over time, the 20% produced, a lifestyle of it. It produced wealth in their hands too.
So also before the Yitzhak, they were told to go and gather from the neighbors and stuff.
Right, well, that's what he's talking about. How did they have anything if Yosef impoverished them? That was his question.
Yeah.
The answer is that was 210 years earlier.
Why did he abolish them? What was
He
it?
thought he was serving the Pharaoh. That's the mistake.
To get an advantage.
Well, I guess so. Maybe he had a cheshbon. Whatever the cheshbon is, in my opinion, the Torah is criticizing him. And
But he doesn't criticize Mamash.
the Torah does not criticize it mamash, but the Torah spends 14 sentences. Extremely rare for the Torah to go into transactions, bartering transactions between Yosef and the Egyptians. For what purpose? My theory is that the purpose was to teach us what not to do. Just like we should learn not to favor one son over another, because that causes jealousy, and because of that jealousy, we ended up in Egypt. Same thing here. The Torah is telling us: do not rob the Hamonam, the peasantry, of its dignity, because they will rise up against you. And this was proven by Jewish history. So maybe my theory is wrong in understanding the Torah, but it's certainly not wrong in Jewish history. Okay.
Square.
Go ahead. Thank you for listening.
Look forward to it every week.
Thank you very much.